Okay, if you'll excuse my terrible voice, uh, I've been sick for the past few weeks and it's just been getting worse. Um, I actually have both a swollen throat and an ear infection, so in really good shape here, guys. Uh, I'm going to do my best, so let's get right to it. Giambattista Vico is an interesting figure. He, depending on who you ask, is late Renaissance, early Enlightenment philosopher. Uh, Bucked a lot of the trends that we consider to be sort of solidly entrenched in the history of literary study. Uh, he doesn't really fit easily into any category, but he's extremely important, and I hope that we can uncover why. So, excuse me, the new science, Scienza Nuova, was first published in 1725. Our edition, the one that's translated in our Norton, is from the third edition published in 1744, the year of his death. And so at various points, you may have noticed in the anthologized section, he references his first edition. This is third edition. It was not well received in his lifetime, in part because it doesn't really fit into any of the worldviews that came during his time or immediately after his death. But it prefigured many important ideas, and so it has become extremely influential. The Scienza Nuova was written as a treatise on universal rights, so he's very much an Enlightenment figure in this sense. Vico's humanism reflects a transition between Renaissance and Enlightenment thinking. He has the sort of classical emphasis of the Renaissance without the neoclassicism of the Enlightenment necessarily. And his philology, his understanding of the history of language, his study of the history of language, is part of the universalism undergirding his idea of universal human rights. This is very unusual, interesting, because essentially what Vico is doing is he's taking the study of rhetoric, a study of using the available means of persuasion, the study of writing convincingly, and he is applying it to an understanding of human history, of the history of human ideas, the history of human arts, but also of the history of human institutions. And so he elevates human creativity, poetry, art, literature to this place that is really formative in a way that really nobody had up until that point. So he starts out by saying that by studying the common nature of nations in the light of divine providence, my new science, or new metaphysics, discovers the origins of divine and human institutions in the pagan nations. And in so doing, he's establishing a system of natural law of nations. He is discussing three nearly uniform ages of human history. And he's discussing the way that societies progress consistently and regularly through these ages. His mention of divine providence very much gives a sense of almost a universal destiny granted by God. As with many of the people that we've read, the concept of God as such provides a useful framework, but the idea does not require belief in the religious dogma that the author is using. And in fact, by discussing the light of divine providence and the origins of divine and human institutions, Vico is not even really making a religious argument. He's just kind of saying this is how it's created, this is how society unfolds. Real quick, and I think I mentioned this before, but the term pagan in this context really just means non-Jewish pre-Christian civilizations. People who precede Christianity but are not Jewish, because Jews worship the God of Abraham, who is also the God of Christianity and Islam, and so they would not qualify as pagans. Anyway, now, when Vico says the societies progress consistently and regularly through these ages, he is making some big universal statements. One is that human progress is intelligible. Now, this does not differ from the ideals of the Enlightenment per se. The Enlightenment really is the era where we start to talk about human progress as such, or at least where it gets taken for granted in that way. But you'll see that the movement of that progress is very different. However, he does point out that this is something we can sort of pick out of history, the progress of human history. He also says that it follows a demonstrable order and law. So there is an orderliness to it. There is a law to it. It follows rules, and he's going to show them to us. And then he uses this term, the world of nations. So he is talking about what he refers to as civilized societies, developed modern nations. The world of nations is made by humans, and so can be understood by studying human institutions such as myth, law, language, custom, etc. Remember, prior to the Enlightenment, and really, even well into the Renaissance, a lot of human law was understood as being conveyed by the gods, or God, morality, as an underpinning of national or municipal law is seen by many, even to this day, as coming from divine inspiration. And so, historically speaking, prohibitions against theft and adultery and lying and murder predate our understanding of the writing of the Ten Commandments. And yet, when you go, for example, to the Capitol in Washington, D.C., the Ten Commandments is upheld as the origin of those rules. This is not unique to Christianity or Judaism or Islam. We see this over and over and over again. And so Vico says, well, actually, these are made by humans, and they're understood as coming from divine sources. So we're going to discuss that now. And he does so by proposing 3 ages of human history. The first being the age of the gods, the second being the age of the heroes, the third being the age of men. What's really interesting about this, in my opinion, is that often when we see these golden ages, these ideas of ages of gods and ages of heroes, as you do in Greek mythology and all that, it's almost a way of excusing the shortcomings of the present. Okay, Achilles was brave, so we don't have to be. Jesus was radically charitable so we don't have to be. What's interesting about Vico is that he kind of steps outside of the ethos of these ages. Rather than subscribing to them, he's describing them. And this anticipates quite a few very, very modern currents in literary and artistic criticism. So let's look at these ages as Vico calls them. The first is the age of the gods. According to Vico, humans in the age of gods believed themselves to be under divine government. So you can think of, for example, the ancient Greeks looking to Zeus. You can think of the Hebrews of the Old Testament speaking directly to God through prophets like Moses, Abraham, Noah, etc. There is, in the age of gods, a belief in auspices and oracles. People throughout various mythological religious traditions look to oracles for predictions of the future and look to auspices or natural signs for guidance. In the age of gods, all phenomena are understood as having divine causes. Everything comes from the gods or from God. And as such, societies are ruled by religion and awe. Okay? You may recall the authors that we've read who have dealt with the sublime so far talk quite a bit about awe. Okay? Awe as an emotion, that sense of being overwhelmed by what you experience or by what you hear or understand or don't understand, as it were, is really innate to human experience, and Vico locates it as part of how society actually organizes itself in the age of gods. It's not just an aesthetic experience. It is quite literally part of humanity's understanding of how it fits into the world. And as such, laws are considered divine commandments, okay? And, we don't have to go back to ancient Greece for this, but we can. Ancient Greece has this, ancient Egypt has this, but also Christianity, Judaism, Islam, in their originary Abrahamic texts, literally have divine commandments presented as law. What Vico is observing is that this is not unique to any one society. All right. Although, and he covers this in the section where he talks about Egypt, these societies tend to think that they're the only ones that do it. Next comes the age of heroes. So we go from, Zeus on Mount Olympus to, Achilles in the Iliad. And the age of heroes is the age of aristocratic societies ruled by powerful families that are presumed to be naturally superior. And their natural superiority is a sort of semi-divinity, okay? The mythology of aristocracy, of nobility, this idea that somebody, by virtue of their birth, is inherently better than you and deserves to rule society, according to Vico, is always linked to some relationship with the divine, with the gods, or with God. And so you can think of this as the divine right of kings. You could think of this in many ways. In the age of heroes, justice is based on force and honor, okay? Violence and a code of ethics that governs how we're supposed to respond to violence, all right? Not written laws necessarily or anything like that. And as a result of this, society is always structured hierarchically and ordered inequitably. The people on the top will always lord it over the people on the bottom, and it's just that way in the Age of Heroes. And then finally, the Age of Men, which is what we might typically call civilization or modern society, fully realized humanity. In the Age of Men, we have an understanding of shared humanity. People outside of our own culture are just as human as us, for example. We have the emergence of common law and civil rights. This is not to say that powerful people don't still abuse their power, that there's an elimination of hierarchies, but we start to have an idea of law that governs all people, even kings, even nobles. We have the creation of egalitarian, rational institutions. You start to have national constitutions, for example. You start to have the practice of law, a legal framework that is logical, that everybody must abide by. You start to have governments, you start to have education, etc., etc. All of this comes along with the development of reason, logic, rationalism, the ability to reason through and think of things abstractly as opposed to only looking to the concrete realities of earthly existence. With the development of reason and the creation of rational institutions, you get a receding of divine or mythical explanations for things. At this point, for example, the religious explanations that were once taken as literal become understood perhaps as figurative, open to interpretation, ironic, metaphorical, any number of things. But in terms of literal explanation, we stop, for example, seeing the sun as a chariot riding across the sky. And then we have the establishment of human government in its two forms, democracy and monarchy. One of the things that has often, this is just a side note, one of the things that has often confused students is that Vico puts democracy before monarchy. He says this, democracy comes first and then monarchy. And we tend to think of monarchy as coming first. Because in modern nations, we look at it that way. There was a monarchy, there's revolution, then there's democracy. But in ancient Greece and ancient Rome, the republics actually preceded the empires. It was actually with the fall of the republics that you got the rise of monarchy. And whether that applies across the board, we can that's something that we can debate, the historicity of Vico's description here. But even in places where the actual government institutions don't follow this timeline, to establish a monarchy, there has to be some cooperation among people at the beginning. And so I think that Vico might argue that regardless of whether it's officially established within the government, institution, some sort of democratic governance always precedes a sort of solidly established monarchy. Now, Vico also conceives of each of these ages of humanity as having their own linguistic developments. And so he names these languages of each age. And these languages correspond to the nature and government of their respective eras. So in early civilization, we have a mute or wordless language employing gestures or physical objects that bear a natural resemblance to the ideas signified. In the middle stage, we have heroic emblems such as similes, comparisons, images, metaphors, and natural descriptions. And so in the heroic age, you start to get, for example, the metaphor of the chariot going across the sky. Now, the chariot going across the sky in the heroic age is describing a belief from the earlier age. And then in the third, we have civilized humanity, which is a popularly accepted vocabulary that is understood as originating from humans. It's at this point that human beings understand themselves as being the ones who originated their languages. And Vico says that this is actually the language proper to establish governments, which are either democracies or monarchies. And as such, laws written in the common language are binding to all. If everybody can understand the common language, which is, of course, the vernacular, and the laws are written in the common language, then people will hold governing bodies accountable. You might say, well, that sounds a lot like democracy, and democracy hasn't always been around. That's true, but rebellions have always been around. People have always killed kings who went too far in abusing their power, or rebelled against nobles, or joined up in wars against people that they considered to be abusing their power. And part of this is a shared set of principles, and the only way to have a shared set of principles is to have a shared language with which to communicate those principles. And so the development of this requires a development of a vernacular language in order to communicate law and values. He then goes on to name the languages of each age. And the first is the hieroglyphic language, the second is the symbolic language, and the third is the epistolary language. So let's go into detail about each of these. The hieroglyphic language is sacred and secret, even beyond the sort of sacred languages of Latin or whatever. It stems from mute gestures, in other words, wordless language. And its emphasis is on observance over speech. In other words, you are in the hieroglyphic period, in the age of gods, you are to listen, not to speak. You are not part of the decision-making process as a human being who does not have access to the gods. Vico's examples of societies in the age of gods, or societies in the hieroglyphic phase of language, are Egyptians and Chaldeans. Now, real quick, Egyptians and Chaldeans still exist. This is not to say that Egypt and the various ethnic Chaldeans in places like Syria, Iraq, etc., are stuck in a hieroglyphic phase of language. It's simply that Vico is discussing these phases, the famous phases of these societies, as the hieroglyphic phase. You got to understand that in Vico's time, they hadn't uncovered quite as much archaeological evidence of the timeline of humanity. And so quite a lot of what is being discussed is kind of what they knew. But also, even if we're looking at the entirety of the development of these regions, we can say Vico is talking about pharaonic Egypt and ancient Babylon, right? So you see in here the use of both Egyptian hieroglyphics and Sumerian cuneiform as Egyptian and Chaldean examples of what Vico describes as hieroglyphic language. Next, we have symbolic language. Symbolic language uses resemblances, and these resemblances can be similes, comparisons, images, metaphors, descriptions of nature. We're starting now to get into a more deliberate poetics, and yet we're still not quite at the epistolary, modern, civilized stage. For his example of societies in the symbolic phase, Vico discusses the Scythians, who are the people of the Eurasian steppe. It's a massive section between Europe and Asia, Eastern Europe and Western Asia, Mongolia, parts of Iran, parts of Russia and Siberia, etc. And it's a warlike, nomadic people. So these are people in the Age of Heroes. And then he describes the Phoenicians as a sort of transitional society. The Phoenicians, according to Vico, represent this society that goes from the heroic ethos and transitions into the epistolary phase of language, the age of man. Which, of course, is the fully realized human civilization that employs the vernacular language, that uses one language for the common business of everyday life. You're not being dictated to in a language different from the one that you speak at home. And as a result, the language develops simultaneously with letters. Now, this is important. This is one of the first big statements that Vico makes where he departs from most thinkers, both before and after him. We tend to think of the alphabet as a sort of pictorial representation of spoken language. The idea being that the spoken word comes first, and the written word is a sort of attempt to represent the spoken word. Vico says, no, one doesn't come before the other. In the epistolary phase, language continues to develop past what it was in the symbolic phase. And as such, the development of writing happens right alongside the development of written language. Now, Vico's two examples of societies in the age of men, in other words, societies in the epistolary phase of language, are, of course, the classical Greeks and the classical Romans. Okay? Understand, when I say classical, I'm talking about the sort of pinnacle of their cultural and artistic output. So for the classical Greeks, it's the period of Athenian dominance. And for the classical Romans, it is the sort of late Republic right before the imperial period. This is kind of the peak, or it's usually considered to be the peak of their cultures. And this matters because he does not consider the progress entirely done at this point. So he uses these Italian terms, corsi and ricorsi, which means the course and the recourse. So the course goes the age of gods, the age of heroes, the age of men. And it's always going to be this, right? And it progresses. Sorry. It progresses in this way. Age of gods. And then you can look right across this slide to see this is the 1744 cover, or frontispiece as they called it, of the New Science. And it corresponds pretty neatly to the way that the ages are listed here. The age of gods, the age of heroes, and then the age of men. All right. That's the course of human history. But there is another period. That is decadence. That is the decline and fall of the fully realized society. And Vico's two examples of societies that have made the full course and then recourse are also the Greek and Roman. Remember, so many Renaissance thinkers are basically trying to grapple with this idea of Rome having fallen. And this is something that happened hundreds of years before. But it's just this idea that this fully realized society that we're all trying to emulate did not survive its own greed, its own violence, whatever we blame it on, it fell. Okay. And this, according to Vico, is part of a natural, predictable occurrence within a fully realized society. Essentially, the age of gods becomes the age of heroes, becomes the age of men. The age of men sets up egalitarian, rational institutions. Once those institutions solidify to such an extent that individuals within those institutions can sort of consolidate power and wealth, then it starts to fall apart because we're now not observing the things that made that society work. Things are becoming less equal. Things are becoming less rational. And what eventually happens is that the society falls and it returns to the age of gods. Not immediately, okay? It's usually something that happens over centuries. But regardless of whether Vico's, details on the history of this are entirely correct, that general outline of the cycles of history is pretty solid, all right? Particularly when thinking of the development of empires, okay? Empires, despite the fact that we often think of empire as a sort of outgrowth of monarchy and monarchy as preceding democracy, in most of human history, empires actually come after a more egalitarian period. There usually is a more democratic period before the establishment of regressive, oppressive empires. And so in Rome, you have the fall of the Republic, which, incidentally is exactly what the prequels of Star Wars are showing. They're just putting it in outer space, but that's the fall of the Roman Republic. It happens in ancient Greece. It happens in Egypt. It happens within smaller nations. And many would say that it's currently happening to the United States as the most powerful nation in the world for quite a long time, that the United States is sort of entering its period of imperial decline, in which the institutions can't really support the ways in which they're being used. And as a result, there's a decline in the arts, there's a decline in the ideas of civil and human rights, there's a decline in education, etc., etc., etc. Whether you agree with that or not, honestly, I don't care. But it is a way that U.S. politics and development have been discussed. This is called the recourse. After the fall, you have a society in ruins. People either leave or die or whatever it is. And then at some point, it kind of starts over. And it starts over with irrational, or to use a pretty offensive term, uncivilized versions of human development. In other words, it goes back to the age of gods. Now, one of the revolutionary things about this is that the corsi and ricorsi schema is a really stark departure from both the medieval understanding of societies as static. In other words, every society has its excuse me, every society has its sort of cultural features, and they're always that way. Much of the Renaissance still sort of thought this. Much of the Renaissance sort of started to turn toward the Enlightenment view, which was a view of continuous linear progress. And although Vico talks about progress, he also departs pretty dramatically from the Enlightenment view in that it's not a constant linear upward movement. Things go up and they come down over and over and over and over again. Now, another thing that it does is that it, and this part is a little bit confusing, so I'm going to do my best to explain it, but it universalizes the creative impulse in humans. And when he says poetry, he's often talking literally about what we would call poetry, writing in verse, for example. But he's also using it to talk about creativity in general, the arts, the creative impulse. So he's universalizing this idea of a creative impulse in humans, and in doing so, he also resists the typical universalizing tendencies by considering each society's creations within its historical and material contexts. Let me unpack that. The typical universalism of literary criticism is to universalize the aesthetic standard, to say this is good and this is bad. And through that way of thinking, the tendency is to look at Greek and Roman models and say this is the pinnacle of human society. Greece and Rome are the societies to emulate, okay? And other societies are sort of ranked from there. We have like the ancient Egyptians and the Mesopotamians, who they did important stuff, but they're not quite at the level of the Greeks and Romans. And we have the Scythians, and we have the Carthaginians, and we have barbarians, right? And so what he does away with is the universal aesthetic standard. He says, this doesn't really matter. And not only that, it's also incorrect, because Greece and Rome went through their barbarian periods as well. But he does universalize another aspect of it, which is the poetic impulse in all human beings. Okay? So, by saying all societies are inherently creative, he looks at each society's creative output by considering where it is in its historical material development, rather than saying this is not as good as Greek poetry. He says this corresponds to another point in the development of Greek poetry. And maybe this society won't make it all the way to the Athenian stage, but that's not because the people lack creativity. There are other material things going on. Maybe they were conquered and suffered massacres. Maybe there was a flood that wiped everybody out. Whatever it is, it's not that one society is superior to another. It's that different societies have different material circumstances that create different output. As such, he convincingly argues for a reversal in the understanding of creative and intellectual processes in complex societies. Most theorists, before and after Vico basically consider poetry to be this end point of human development. Even those who argue for a sort of natural inspiration, which Vico does not, by the way, um, they're usually operating from this idea that poetry is part of civilized society. First, you have language, and then you have institutions, and you have education, and you have refinement, and poetry is at the end of that. Okay, poetry is a sign that a civilization is fully realized. Vico flips that on its head and he says, no, poetry actually comes first. Poetry actually comes even before the basic organization of society into governments, factions, hierarchies, whatever. And the thing is, it's not that wild a point. Once you read it, you go, oh, yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. And he does this by using rhetorical principles to systematize human history. Prior to this, and even after, for the most part, not many people do this like Vico does. Rhetorical principles are used primarily to talk about reading and writing, okay, or speeches, or oral speech. He uses these principles of rhetoric to talk about how all of human history, all human institutions develop. And it's a really revolutionary move. All of this is predicated on the poetic nature of early humans, which is another very unique aspect of Vico's understanding of the development of human eras. Now, according to Vico's description, early humans did not think abstractly. Now, what does abstract mean? Abstract is one of those terms that we use without defining, and one of the reasons for that is because of what it describes. To put it very simply, abstract thought is thought that describe, or abstract language is language that describes concepts not attached to concrete things, right? So ideas rather than events or objects. And so without the ability to think abstractly, perceptions of reality were based on imagination, emotion, and sensory experience. Now, he's describing a primitive stage in human development. You can talk about that as early human development in terms of societies. You can also talk about that as early human development in terms of the age of an individual. In other words, the way that children think. But what's interesting about this emphasis on imagination, emotion, and sensory experience is that he's also describing poetry. Because what is poetry if not imaginative, emotional, and sensory, right? So, lacking the ability to talk about abstract concepts, primitive humanity thinks poetically rather than rationally. Rational thinking, reason, logic, these are abstractions. These are the ability to think of ideas like justice, freedom, as abstracted from the realities in front of you that you witness, that you feel. But without those abstractions, you think imaginatively, emotionally, and through the senses, which is in its essence poetic. And I'm not going to go through the whole sort of breakdown, but Vico does break this down for a few paragraphs before page 355 in our edition, and essentially comes to this conclusion that all the primary figures of speech are corollaries of poetic logic, which is interesting because, again, he's flipping the usual way that we think about figures of speech and poetic thinking. The typical way of thinking about creativity, art, poetry, and figures of speech is to think of them as these examples of civilized human achievement. And what Giambattista Vico says is actually these are there right from the beginning of human consciousness. That actually humanity is always thinking poetically before anything else. And so rather than thinking that poetry, in order to enter a society, requires a certain level of civilization, rather poetry precedes learning. And the primary figures of speech, as Vico conceives of them, are metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, and irony. So the way that Vico describes metaphor, which is sort of the main figure of speech, he describes it as the most luminous, the most brilliant, let's say. By the way, the use of the word brilliant is actually a metaphor, but I'll get into that later. It's the most luminous, basic, and common. It's the most common, but it is the most important, the brightest. The basic definition of metaphor, this is not from Vico, this is just a basic definition of the word, is when a word is applied to an object or action to which it is not literally applicable. So the word brilliant or luminous means full of light. When we call something good, like very good, and we call it brilliant, that's a metaphor, right? If we refer to the sun as a chariot moving across the sky, that's a metaphor. It's different from a simile, which says it's like a chariot moving across the sky. But that's sort of semantic difference, I guess. Now, here are some of the ways that Vico describes metaphor. He says that metaphor confers sense on insensate objects. It takes objects that don't have senses, don't have consciousness, and it suggests that they do have consciousness. So the man in the moon, for example, is a metaphor that suggests a personality in the moon. It gives animate substance to inanimate objects. The sun as a god moving across the sky animates an object that is not animated in the way that we think of human beings moving or thinking or speaking. And in so doing, every metaphor is a miniature myth. So as early human beings look to the sky, and without the benefit of astronomy or even basic experience, they misunderstand the sun. And they try to explain it as best they can, so they conceive of it in the terms they understand. It's a person moving across the sky, right? They invent metaphor in that moment because they misunderstand, or because they're trying to explain. It has nothing to do with like intelligence. It's just lack of information, lack of development of reason. But in doing that, they they write myths. Every metaphor, then, according to Vico, is a miniature myth. Um, and one of the ways that he makes the argument, and I'm simplifying this, he does it in a much more interesting and complex way, but one of the ways that he makes the argument that this is an observable phenomenon throughout various societies is that all languages use metaphor to describe inanimate objects. Every language we know of. Vico is right about this in the 16th century as he is now. Every language that we know of uses metaphors to describe inanimate objects. And this is not a development of advanced modern civilizations. This always dates from the rustic origins of society. It always dates from the pre-modern, pre-industrial, even pre-alphabet versions of every language. Now, one of the concepts that Vico employs, although he doesn't name it that I know of, he might elsewhere in the book, but is the dead metaphor. Now, this is an interesting way of explaining how important metaphor is to the development of language and how it actually is a basic part of communication rather than some advanced creative process. And the dead metaphor describes a metaphor that is so established within the vernacular that it has ceased to be recognized by most people as a metaphor. It's a metaphor. So if you think about what metaphor does, right? Just look at the definitions that we have here and Vico's descriptions. A metaphor makes inanimate objects feel animate. It gives objects that don't have senses imaginary sense. It creates miniature myths, right? A dead metaphor still technically does that, but it operates in language in a way that doesn't feel that way. Okay, so if a metaphor is luminous, right? It shines, it's brilliant. Those are also, of course, metaphors. But it strikes the listener or the reader in a way that is remarkable for its creativity. It is what we would call poetic, right? But if I call something brilliant to say that it's good, it doesn't hit you in that way. You don't go, oh, that's an interesting use of the word. No, you don't think of it as a metaphor. You just think brilliant means very good, when in fact it means shining with light, right? Some other dead metaphors, and actually he uses this specific one, is the coast. The word coast to define the edge of a parcel of land, the edge of a continent touching the ocean, is actually derived from the Latin word for rib. Okay, and I don't know about all Latin-derived languages, but as far as I know, some version of the word costa is denotes rib in most Latin, if not all Latin-derived languages. In fact, the language that I grew up speaking, Portuguese, one of the common usages of the plural costas is actually a term for the back. So you would refer to your back as like a collection of ribs, which is a sort of multi-layered metaphor. In any case, we're talking about a metaphor that has so established itself within the language that it's not a metaphor anymore. If you talk about the coast, the West Coast of the United States, you know what it means. You're not speaking metaphorically. It's just a word. But at its root, the coast comes from the word for ribs, denoting the side of a body attached to the spine. Why? Why is that? Is it because society had to develop to a certain point before they could describe a coast? We had to develop scholarship and alphabet and religions and beliefs before we could get to a place where we could talk about the western edge of the continent? No. It precedes all of that. When humanity, according to Vico, finds that it needs to communicate the place where the land touches the ocean, and they lack a word for it, they resort to describing it as a corollary with a part of their body. They invent metaphor. The coast of the nation, of the continent, is the rib of that plot of land. Another dead metaphor is the broken heart, okay? You don't think twice when you say that someone is brokenhearted, but that's actually a multi-layered metaphor. If you were to speak to an alien from outer space and tell them that you're brokenhearted, they would think that you had some sort of disease, right? The heart as the locus of romantic sentiment, of erotic love, right, is in itself a metaphor, right? The heart is it just pumps blood. It has nothing to do with whether you love or don't love. And then, in addition to that, the sadness, the feeling of sadness that comes from the loss of love or the longing for somebody being described as that blood pumping organ breaking. These are multi-layered metaphors, okay? And finally, the tooth of a saw, okay? Here again, we have an inanimate object being conferred with human attributes, all right? It makes perfect sense. We don't think twice when we talk about the tooth of a saw, but you are using technically a metaphor when you talk about the tooth of a saw, okay? Or the foot of a bed, right? And so you've got to imagine when you think of these dead metaphors as aspects of the language that just sort of no longer astonish us, you've got to imagine that at its first usage, the broken heart or the tooth of the saw or the coast of the continent must have been as interesting to the people who heard it as it would be to describe the sun as a person flying across the sky. All right? What Vico is essentially saying is that these common uses of language are just as poetic as the ones that we still consider to be explicit metaphors. And so, metaphor as a poetic device actually precedes the later developments in language, and so also the later developments of society. Next, we have metonymy. And metonymy is defined as when a feature of or associated with a thing is substituted for the thing itself. Okay? He describes this as something that happens by using sensible ideas. Right? And so Vico says that he just gives some examples where he says, for example, that metonymy substitutes the author for the author's work. So if I tell you, read page 356 in Vico, right? Uh, I'm actually saying read page 356 of the Norton Anthology's section from the New Science. But we use the expression Vico, we say Vico to describe it. His name is associated with his book. We're only reading one book by Giambattista Vico. So if I say, find this in Vico, you know what I mean, right? He also says that it substitutes the object for its form or accidents. So, for example, when we say the crown, we're talking about a royal family, okay? You're discussing British politics, and you say, this announcement was made by the crown. We're talking about an announcement being made by the representatives of the royal family. But we know what that means. You're talking about a feature of the royal family or an object associated with the royal family to describe the royal family. And then he says it's also, another example is when it substitutes the cause, for the effect. So describing death as pale. You see this in the Bible, right? Death is described as riding a pale horse. We will often describe death with personified features. Not only in the strict metaphor of, the figure of death, like the Grim Reaper, but also in just the way we describe death. Because, and again, this might not be something you think about all the time, but death as a concept is abstract. Death as a process might describe something physical, a phenomenon, the breakdown of the body. But death, the idea of this end of life, is abstract. You don't experience it. You don't see it. You don't know what it feels like. But you do know how to talk about it. All right? That's an abstraction. That's a very sophisticated use of the brain and of language and of logic. And Vico basically suggests that in the same way that children have to learn language, early humanity, while developing its languages, while developing its ideas, must have had a point in which we were like trying these ideas out. And we didn't have these abstractions. We didn't have this linguistic and cognitive sophistication. And so we would have had to speak of the non-abstract, the concrete, the realities that we can see and feel. And we would have been using poetic devices like metonymy, which uses a feature to substitute for the thing itself. And likewise, Vico says, this continues to create miniature myths, okay, such as the figure of death as this personified creature or person or ghost. So a really common example of this would be to refer to a favorite meal as a dish. What's your favorite dish? Right? For me, it's one of my favorite dishes is Kung Pao chicken, or as my daughter calls it, birthday chicken, because on my birthday, we, for at least for the time that she can remember, have tended to get takeout food from a favorite restaurant of mine, and one of the dishes that she really enjoys from there is Kung Pao chicken, so she calls it birthday chicken. But just to say it's my favorite dish is itself a use of metonymy. I don't eat the plate, do I? No. And even if I did, that's not what I'm using, but that's not the point, right? When I say my favorite dish is Kung Pao chicken, I am using an expression, I'm using a word associated with the food, the dish, to describe the food. Same thing when we talk about Hollywood. When we say something is happening in Hollywood, Hollywood is suffering because of Donald Trump's tariffs. Hollywood has developed since the days of silent film. Hollywood has a major problem with sexual harassment and child abuse. In none of those examples am I talking about the city of Hollywood. I'm talking about the film industry. The film industry is localized all over the place, not just Hollywood. But when we say Hollywood, we know that we are talking about the industry of making films, right? That's metonymy. It uses a feature of or associated with something in order to describe the thing itself. Now, synecdoche is a specific form of metonymy, whereas metonymy would be the umbrella term for naming something based on a feature or an associated idea. Synecdoche specifically is talking about the relationship between the part and the whole. So synecdoche is when a part is made to represent the whole, or the whole is made to represent the part. All right. Vico describes synecdoche as developing when people raised particulars to universals or united parts to form wholes. And so you've got to think of this in terms of what he's imagining, what he's suggesting here. Synecdoche arises when we, as a species, find the need to describe things in groups or categories. We don't tend to think of groups or categories as abstractions, but they are, okay? So when we say, when we talk about a crowd, right? What is a crowd? A crowd is, in terms of our sensual perception, what we see or what we can feel or hear, a crowd is actually a collection of individuals. It's a bunch of individuals together. Okay? The idea that we can describe a collection or a group as a category is abstract. What the ear picks up, what the eye picks up, is not the abstraction. It is all those individuals together. When we speak it into existence, then we're abstracting. This is important because we have tended throughout human history to think of synecdoche as this sophisticated, advanced aspect of language. It's a poetic device. It's a rhetorical device, a literary device, with the suggestion being that society has to reach this advanced stage before it can understand these sorts of sophisticated concepts. And what Vico argues here is that actually we're this sophisticated as human beings from the start. That calling humans man, which is a form of synecdoche, using one man to represent all humans, is an early form of abstraction. If I say, since the beginning of man, you know that I'm not talking about all men, or you know that I'm not talking about one man. You know that I'm not even only talking about men. I'm talking about all humans, okay? That's an abstraction that precedes more advanced forms of communication. Similarly, objects abstracted from their materials. So to refer to clothing as threads, all right, is a form of metonymy. You're using the thread, which is a part, to represent the whole, which is the clothing, the product of the thread. And although synecdoche is a form of metaphor, of metonymy, one of the distinguishing characteristics, according to Vico, is that synecdoche kind of complicates it. It brings more complexity to rural metaphors, and it starts to show linguistic development over time. So in the example that one of the examples that he uses, he talks about the third harvest. He talks about Ovid describing the third harvest to discuss the passage of time. Now, that might not seem like a big deal. He's talking about, 3 years, I guess. But the idea that somebody can say third harvest and everybody know what he means is already revealing that certain norms had been established within society that are linked to rural phenomena, agriculture, the passage of the seasons, whatever. And so synecdoche is a part of early human language and concepts, but it's also showing us this development into something more complex. So another, common example would be wheels for a car. You describe a car as wheels, right? Or when we talk about a head count, right? We talk about a head count, we're talking about counting people, but we're referring to their heads, a part of the body, a part of the person, or almost anything referring to hands. Right? Give me a hand. That's synecdoche. Now, the one figurative use of language that Vico attributes to a more advanced stage of society is irony. The basic definition of irony, as you know, is when what is said is different from, or often the opposite of, what it intends to express. Put more simply, saying something and meaning something else, or saying something and meaning the opposite. According to Vico, irony, unlike everything else, can only arise in an age capable of reflection. It can only arise in an age in which humanity has some reasoning capacity. And not just capacity, but ability to communicate it. He describes it as falsehood in a mask of truth, or vice versa. It can also be truth in a mask of falsehood. He describes it as a departure from the necessary sincerity of primitive peoples. By necessary sincerity, he means non-abstract uses of language. In other words, if primitive peoples and primitive uses of language are describing things in the most concrete, visible, sensible way, irony is a departure from that. Irony quite literally describes what is not being seen or heard or felt. And that's a level of abstraction that doesn't really work for these earlier types of language that Vico describes. So let me unpack what I just said a bit. Irony is a way of talking about things that is different from the way that those things, in a literal sense, are supposed to be talked about. Okay? Implied in that definition is that there is a baseline understanding, social understanding among everybody who uses this vernacular of what it's supposed to be like. This suggests a wide-scale development of the vernacular that creates a baseline understanding of reality, which can then be violated by the ironic speech act. In other words, in order for irony to work, the people who are listening and understanding it have to understand the non-ironic usage of the word or expression to get the joke. This is one of the reasons that it's often hard to understand irony in translation. If we don't understand the language that is being ironic in its original form, it's sometimes hard to get the joke of the irony because we don't have the same baseline understanding of the reality that is shared by the native users of that vernacular. This is a much more sophisticated use of language than metaphor, right? Metaphor might be, as Vico describes it, more luminous, more interesting in its poeticism, but it's much more rudimentary in terms of the cognitive function, which honestly proves his point. The more luminous, more poetic version of things is actually the earlier one, not the more developed one. Okay? Metaphor, I mean, think of the uses of metaphor versus irony. You know, irony tends to have a sort of wry tone to it, whereas metaphor often feels very grandiose. Okay? One of the ways that we can think about this is to contrast irony with the earnestness of more primitive forms of communication. Okay? This sheds some light on the sincerity of mythology in the age of gods or the age of heroes. Okay? And if you don't want to use the idea of primitive peoples, which honestly sounds kind of racist, you can think of it in terms of children. All right? If you listen to a child who is learning to speak but doesn't necessarily have the words for everything, when they run up against a concept that they can't describe, they either clam up and just don't talk about it, or they try to talk around it. And sometimes when they try to talk around something that they don't quite understand, they produce language that feels very poetic. Children are constantly saying things that sound extremely deep. They're constantly inventing metaphors and metonymies and synecdoches because they actually don't yet possess all the abstractions that they will when they understand the language better. Now compare that to irony, okay? The example of irony that I used earlier in the semester was in discussing natural versus given signs, where I was talking about the rose, right? A rose bush is a natural sign of a body of water, of fresh water nearby. But a red rose, is a given sign of love. And a red rose given to you by somebody that you know hates you, might strike you as ironic. The only reason that irony works is because there is a baseline understanding of the symbolism of the red rose. In a society where red rose does not mean love, there is no irony to a red rose being given to you by somebody who hates you. So irony, according to Vico, is a sign of a more linguistically, cognitively advanced society. And remember, when Vico talks about primitive societies, it sounds racist as hell. I realize that. And let's be real, he was writing in the 16th century. It probably just is. But also, he's not doing the typical thing of saying there are societies that are inherently primitive and there are societies that are inherently less primitive. No. Vico says the Greeks and the Romans are only superior to us because they kind of went through the whole circuit. And actually, then they fell and they went back. According to Giambattista Vico, all humans have this capacity. Whether a society develops to the point at which they are producing a ton of poetry and art and philosophy is not a matter of the inherent superiority or inferiority of the people, but of the material conditions that accelerate or impede their advancement through that cycle, the corsi and the ricorsi. So anyway, here are some visual examples of irony, because I've been using visual examples, I'm going to continue using visual examples, even though it makes more sense to use verbal examples. And so, anyway, here are some visual examples of irony. You see in this top example a photo of a sign that says no photography. There's the irony, of course, being that we're looking at a photo of something that prohibits photography. Likewise, on the left-hand side, a seagull sitting on a sign that says, no seagulls, which honestly is probably an altered image now that I think about it. My assumption originally would have been that this says don't feed the birds. But actually, if you look at the outline of the seagull in the sign, it's too close to the actual bird. So I don't think this is real. Which in itself, there's a level of irony to my error here, but whatever. And then we have this last one, which is some graffiti from a protest years ago. I believe in Peru, but I'm not sure. And it says contra toda autoridad excepto mi mamá. In other words, to translate that into English, against all authority except my mother's. And this has multiple ironic registers. The anarchy symbol for that first A, the idea of respecting your mother and doing so in graffiti, the clever joke about rejecting authority but respecting your mother, and all of this is very simple to us because we understand the baseline register of the initial abstractions: authority, motherhood, graffiti, all right, and what they mean. There is a transgression of all of these meanings that makes it ironic, that makes it funny. If you don't understand that initial register, if, for example, you live in a society where mothers have no authority, I don't know what that society would be. Let's say there's a society where mothers have no authority over their kids, or where graffiti is not even a thing. It's just you can write on things whenever you want. Then this joke doesn't work. It works because we have a shared baseline reality that is being transgressed, that is being violated, and that makes the joke. All right. Now, when we look at all these figures of speech together, okay, especially once we get through that entire cycle and we understand irony as being sort of a separate thing or a more advanced cognitive linguistic function, what Vico is showing us is that these figures reveal early language as embodying human experience rather than describing it objectively. When, according to Vico, when primitive humanity looks at the ocean and tries to describe the danger of the ocean combined with the necessity of the ocean for food and for travel, and that primitive human being describes it as a capricious God who sometimes loves you and sometimes wants to kill you, what Vico says is that that is not the creative act of a scholar standing back and trying to describe it objectively and coming up with some clever way to describe it. It's actually the creative act of a person who still lacks the vocabulary to think of concepts like death or travel or starvation, and instead uses the vocabulary at their disposal and describes it in terms that are closer to their embodied experience. So the moon is a person. The sun is another person. The sea is an angry god. The coast is a set of ribs. And as we get farther and farther away from the most elemental aspects of experience, the things that give us food, the things that kill us, then we can abstract more and more and more into until we get into concepts like freedom, for example. So language grows organically from the poetic need to make sense of a terrifying, mysterious world, not the other way around. And this is the revolutionary observation that Vico makes. For most of, honestly, for most of human history, from Plato till today, we think of creativity as something that comes after cognitive development. That in order to have poetry, in order to have art, a society must develop to a particular point. Giambattista Vico says no. We do that as soon as we experience the world, as soon as we experience a scary world and we're overwhelmed by the sublimity of it, by its beauty, by its capacity to feed us and to kill us and to nurture us and to starve us. We start to try to make sense of it, but we don't have the language for it, so we start to use the concepts that we have, and those concepts are embodied, rudimentary, concrete things, and so we are immediately using metaphor. We are poets from the start. Poetry comes first, then institutions. And poetry in this sense means both literature and just general creativity. So I have this sort of exercise here, and this is going to be part of the discussion prompt. And I want you to look for Vico's figures of speech. So how many of the figures of speech described by Vico can you spot in the following snippet of career advice? I would like you to identify them, and I would like you to explain what makes each of these an instance of either metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, or irony. So here's the statement. My old friend started out in hospitality years ago as a gopher, doing dishes and occasionally giving the line chefs a hand. But she showed a lot of heart, and her work ethic was on another level. During the pandemic, she got a call from the White House kitchen and has been a rising star on the food scene ever since. She gave her whole life to that job. So if you want to be a top chef, the formula's easy. Sacrifice everything you love, burn the candle at both ends for a couple decades, and pray like your life depended on it. So in the discussion prompt, I would like you to answer the question at the top of that slide. And finally, I want to end with some of the words that Vico gives us about humanity's inherent poeticism. Firstly, the proper subject of poetry is a believable impossibility. Okay? Why do I have Superman in this slide? Because what we're talking about here is something that Aristotle and Horace both talked about, which is a level of appropriateness, which is not what Vico is describing, but it's something similar in the sense of being a description of plausibility over possibility. When we think of the superhero, Superman is impossible. Okay? Superman does things that are only possible as imaginative, creative acts. But within the ethos of the universe in which Superman exists, his actions are believable. So can a human fly? No. But if a human can fly and has superpowers, they should use that in the ways that Superman does. All right? It was fear that invented gods in the world, and not fear inspired by other people, but fear born within their own minds. The creation of gods is something that Vico describes as poetic. It's a creative act. And it's not a creative act of people with advanced vocabularies and capacity for reason. It's a creative act of people who are afraid of the world in which they live. People who are at an early stage of human development, maybe living in caves, right? Life is cheap. You can die. You can be eaten by a lion. You can starve. And that fear creates a necessity for conceiving of the world in a way that requires you to try to explain it. And if you don't have the words to explain it, then you use the words that you have. And this, according to Giambattista Vico, is the origin of the gods. Poetry was born sublime precisely because it lacked rationality. Here again, that reversal of the common way of thinking of this. Poetry does not emerge from a rationality that surpasses the rationality of an average person. Rather, poetry is there when a child starts to speak. And when that child doesn't know how to identify something, they do the best they can. That is a creative act, all right? And then finally, this wisdom was in fact the popular wisdom of the lawgivers found in mankind rather than the esoteric wisdom of a few lofty philosophers. Remember, Aquinas, Maimonides, Augustine, these guys are all guarding the world's wisdom. Giambattista Vico says that's nonsense. You might be doing that now, you might be gatekeeping it, but that's not how the wisdom started. In fact, the wisdom started from the creative acts of people who preceded the societies that came from those creative acts. And so if you think, for example, of stories from the Old Testament, the law of God is handed down by Moses, right? And by the time this is written down, we're already in a at least heroic level of society, possibly epistolary. But just to think of the story itself, the law is handed down by God. The story that is told of the law being handed down by God is the story of a people wandering in the desert. So the laws that emerge from that, when you see the Ten Commandments up in the Capitol, and you go, all right, the United States Constitution is derived from principles that are themselves derived from the Ten Commandments and Hammurabi's Code and the Magna Carta, Giambattista Vico says, yeah, fine. Those laws came from somewhere primitive. They came from primitive poetic acts, not the other way around. And for that reason, Vico says that poetic wisdom was the first wisdom of the world. This is revolutionary in many ways. Just to give a quick rundown of why it's important for our purposes, it's one of the first historicist accounts of human culture. It's one of the first rhetorical accounts of human culture that takes the principles of rhetoric outside of just language and talks about how it shapes society. And it's one of the first anthropological accounts of human culture. It anticipates Romanticism's emphasis on the power of humanity's innate creativity, the idea that all human beings have this in them, and that linking to our emotions and nature is actually a poetic act, as opposed to the Enlightenment view that the farther we get away from nature, the more advanced we are and more creative we are. The Romantics sort of move toward nature for inspiration. And that idea that this is inborn comes from Vico, or at least is first brought up with Vico. It also anticipates much later movements, such as structuralism in the 20th century, which understands culture and literature as having discernible patterns even in varied mythologies. So Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Scythians, the Phoenicians, Athens, Rome. Picking up these archetypes is something that structuralism will do. Also, post-structuralism uses this broader definition of figurative language that sees almost everything as metaphorical. This starts with Vico, or at least is anticipated by Vico. And then finally, and maybe most importantly, it shifts the critical emphasis from judging based on universal standards to trying to understand things based in their historical contexts. Rather than looking for one or another to be superior, we try to understand them based on the world in which they are produced. And so in recognizing the importance of myth and poetry in the creation of human societies, Vico lays the groundwork. Yeah, I know. For later theories that treat literature as a form of social knowledge. And in that way, Vico's new science is revolutionary because it shows that human history, literature, language, and honestly, its institutions like law are not random, nor are they purely rational. It's not all inspiration or art. They're the necessary products of human imagination responding to the conditions of life. I'm afraid of the dark, so I make up a light god, right? And so understanding early societies requires understanding not just of what they did or what they said, but how they thought. And that thought, Vico shows us, was at its core fundamentally poetic.